Hi there and welcome back. This week we are going to be dealing with fats. Last module we dealt with the bread. I ended up making the homemade bread with the different pre-ferments. This module covers lipids, fats as most of you guys have seen. I'm actually going to be doing the pastry portion of one of our cooking options, and I did not use one of the recipes again from the text that was available. I looked up my own recipe from America's Test Kitchen. It's called the Foolproof Dough. And according to them, they have gotten the perfect dough, and I actually wanted to try it out because it's got a secret ingredient kind of to add moisture to it, but keep the gluten from forming. But I'll get to that in a little bit. As you guys know, McGee has quoted pastries as being pastries an expression of the fragmentary, discontinuous particulate qualities of wheat flour. What does that mean? Basically, we're going to be using fats to separate different particles of the flour away from the dough that has already developed its gluten. So that way we actually get the crumble texture, or what you are mostly familiar with American pies. It's got a flaky texture, but then when you also bite into it, you still get clumps of flour that kind of break off and crumble into your mouth. That is actually due to the fat that's separating the dough from the different particles of flour, so there's not as much moisture and there's not as much gluten built up as in the homemade bread. To make this dough, some of the ingredients that we're going to need today is going to be an all-purpose flour. I use the Gold Medal brand. All-purpose flour is going to have a little less protein than that bread flour that I had before. I calculated out it's at a 10% protein, whereas the last time it was at a 13.3%, I think, for the Knight's bread flour. The next ingredient is going to be the fine Mediterranean sea salt again. Along with that, we're going to be adding sugar, which I use just Kroger's Great Value. Any type of plain white sugar will work. Along with that Kroger's brand, I also got unsalted butter from Kroger's. We're going to need some shortening. Going to use some Crisco, all vegetable. This is the special ingredient here, actually, vodka. I'm going to be using Gordon's. Step up from McCormick's. It's no Grey Goose, but we're going to be cooking with it, not drinking it, so no worries on quality of taste for that. And then lastly, some good old tap water. As for the experiments that I'm actually going to be conducting today, I'm going to have 3 of them. I'm going to be using the regular recipe, what called vodka and the chilled butter. I'm going to have another experimented one where I don't use the vodka, and I actually replace that 1/4 cup of vodka with the water, so we'll have a 1/2 cup of water rather than a 1/4 of each. For the third one, I'm actually going to test, still using the vodka, but I'm going to incorporate melted or heated butter and shortening to kind of show you what will happen if you don't use the cold butter. It should cause a problem with the flakiness and dividing the dough from the actual flour itself, but we will see that after I make it. I'm going to be making the 3 pies, and then after that, then I'm going to have to refrigerate them, bake them, and I'm going to be making some cream pies, so we'll just be baking the dough, not actually baking the insides with it. So let's get started. The recipe does call for a food processor. I did not have a food processor, but luckily one of my roommates had available one of the Magic Bullets. I'm sure you guys have seen these on TV. They come with a blender bottom and a top. One of the concerns I had was that there might not be enough room in one of these containers, because this is the largest container that they have. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to split the recipe in half and use 2 of these, and then combine them later for the third step before I add the vodka and water. Alright, we've got 2 very blended flour, salt, and sugar concoctions. Next we're going to need is the butter and the shortening. Yeah, this texture here on this shortening is almost the consistency of icing. Just so you guys know, I'm sure you guys have read on this, but we're working with lipids this week, and a lipid or a fat can be considered a triglyceride as one of the forms, or di or monoglyceride. But basically the main component of it is a glycerol background with 3 fatty acids. If it's a di and mono, then it's only going to have 2 or 1 free fatty acid. Or I guess it's not free. Fatty acid that's connected to it, polar, which means that they do not have a negative and positive end. That's why they are hydrophobic, and they do not mix well with water. Unless it's a di or monoglyceride, then those actually help create the phospholipid bilayers, or they're also located in egg yolks as a lichen, and it actually acts as the emulsification, or helps with the emulsification, because one of the heads is polar as the tail is non-polar. So it can form to hold all of the fat on the inside, but still can mix with water on the outside because of the polar head. Okay, we're going to be adding the remaining flour to this. The consistency they said in the recipe should resemble some cottage cheese curds, which is kind of what we're getting here, broken up pieces. We're going to add the remainder of this flour, and once that goes in, we're going to be throwing it into our mixing bowl and adding our moisture. Whew. Oh, welcome back. No, I promise I've been cooking this entire time. Just to show you guys, I have my mixture from the 2 bullet blenders. As you can see, they've been broken up almost to the size of like pea size, maybe macadamia nut size, a little bit bigger. But just to show you that those little clumps are actually the fat that's surrounded by the flour, separating the two from the dough, from the actual flour itself. What we're going to do is we're going to add this 1/4 a cup of water, like so. Then we're going to measure out 1/4 of a cup of our Gordon's vodka. The recipe calls for it chilled. I just left mine in the freezer overnight. Since ethanol does not freeze, I don't have to worry about any glass shattering or anything like that. Got a 1/4 cup of my vodka. I'm going to pour that in. Then I'm going to take a rubber spatula, and I'm just going to start working down the sides, trying to get all the moisture mixed around the dough. And it's going to start creating a sticky, almost tacky texture. Once that happens, then I know that I'm good to go, that it's fully mixed, and that'll be time to start rolling out the dough and get ready for refrigeration. The reason why that we're using the vodka as the special ingredient, the reason for this is, if you guys remember from last week when we were making our breads, it was all about making a strong protein structure from the gluten. Well, the gluten's still present. Like I said, there's still 10% in this all-purpose flour here. And any of the water that mixes with that flour is going to, work with the gliadin and glutenin to create gluten. And with the vodka incorporated instead, vodka is only 60% water rather than 100% water, and the other 40% being the ethanol. Well, the ethanol is not going to have that same reaction. It's not going to create the gluten. So what happens is we get partial gluten, so we still get some structure of it forming, but we're actually going to have a softer, more tender crust. And that's the reason why they go for that. And then you don't have to worry about the vodka being in, because it'll bake off. Since it's such a volatile compound, it'll go up in the air very, very quickly once added heat. Our wrapped, beautiful product. One thing that you want to keep note on that is that recipe that I used actually is for a top and bottom layer. So if you were actually going to be making a pie that had the top crust on it. So for the next 2 experiments, I'm actually just going to half the recipe, because I only need the bottom part since I'm making a cream pie instead of an actual baked top layer pie. So just keep note that I'm only going to be using half of the recipe, so using one of these just so I can have one of those discs for the bottom plate for the 3 pies. Alright guys, I've got this batch all done. As you can see, it's the half batch, so there's not as much filling up the bowl. But it still has the cottage cheese texture to it. Still about the pea size, macadamia nut, whichever one you want to go with on that. In this experiment, we're not using any vodka, and since the recipe is halved, rather than using a half cup of moisture, we're actually going to be using only a 1/4, which will be all water. And I'm going to just sprinkle it in. Then I'm going to start working around with the rubber spatula again as those gluten bonds start forming. And once I get a nice tacky mixture and it all becomes one single mass, I will once again roll it out into that 4 to 5 inch disc, wrap it in plastic, and then put it into the guys. We got the fat melted for our third experiment. We're going to actually use melted fat or melted lipids instead of the chilled ones as the recipe calls for. As you can see, I've got some melted here. Most of the shortening's all the way down, but I'm just going to toss it in. There's still a little bit of solidified spots, but for the most part, all the butter's melted. It's just the shortening that's kind of sticking around. Okay, one thing that you want to notice with this, actually, I've gotten it in and I'm blending it up, but it actually has that pancake batter as before, like last week's bread that we were making. It's not in clumps or anything like the cottage cheese as we've seen in the other two experiments. Alright guys, this is the dough that I used just the water on. I didn't add any vodka to it. It's a little stiffer than like the other doughs were. But I believe that's probably because it's been sitting in the fridge for about an hour now. The fats have started solidifying. Along with the recipe, what we're going to do is it calls for 1/4 of a cup down onto the table as we roll it out so it doesn't stick and it can collect some of that flour for even more separation. So I'm just going to do that. It calls for about a 12-inch disc, but I'm using about a 9-inch pan. So I'm going to try to go for that, but a little bit further than the 9 inches so it can have some overhang. I'm just going to place it in the flour just so, and then just start rolling it out. The recipe does call for about 1/8 of an inch thick, so I'm going to try to get about the right length I'm looking for along with the right thickness. After that, what we're going to do is we're going to place it in the pan, and I'm going to take aluminum foil and actually line the dough with it, and I'm going to have some dough weights on it to actually keep it from bubbling up while it's baking. So then the pie will have uniform cooking and keep the shape it's supposed to. Alright, one thing I wanted to note is I started rolling out the one that I used the melted butter and shortening, and it actually is not staying together very well. I'm having a hard time keeping it in one cohesive piece. It wants to keep separating from itself, and I think it might be because, you know, the over blending or the fact that the fats have been mixed. The shortening and the butter are going to have definitely different melting times, and I think that it's supposed to be, you know, like the book says, separated, particle separation. That's not going to be happening with this, I have a feeling, but I'm doing my best to keep it in shape. Hopefully I can get into this pie crust and get it where it needs to be without it cracking up too much, but we'll see what happens. Got the doughs out of the refrigerator. One thing I wanted to add on to the point about the solidification, putting it in the fridge, this will also help the dough relax, which will allow or prevent it from shrinking in the oven during the baking. Alright guys, just got these out of the oven. Some things that I'm noticing is, this is the one that had the vodka with the water. Has a really good crumbly texture. Not so much flaky, but really like a crumble, like I just got like a huge piece of dough and it just disintegrated in my mouth. This one with the water that did not have the vodka in it, I noticed that it burnt a little bit on the inside, and I made sure were the same thickness, and that just kind of tells you that it might have started cooking off faster, or something that raised the temperature to start kind of darkening the dough a little bit more. This one's good. It kind of has a flaky texture. It's not disintegrating as much as the crumble of this one. I would say it has a little bit of a higher strength. This pie just did not turn out very well. Like, the crust was falling apart. It was really hard to work with. This was the one that I used the melted butter, and I think it was just, you know, strictly with that particle separation. The fat gives it the support of you know, keeping the structure that it needs to, especially because it has a low gluten amount. Out of all of them, I haven't even tried this one yet. It has a flaky texture, that's for sure, and it and a little bit of the particle separation. I just don't think it's a very malleable dough. So it's a good taste. just a little hard to work with.